Hello and welcome to the Data Protection Made Easy podcast. This is season 2, episode 32. We're back with another GDPR radio session. I've been joined today by Amber Sivill. Amber, how are we doing?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How did you find the session?
Yeah, it was a good one. We talked about lots of different news pieces, some of which are quite interesting. Kind of repetitive, I think. We've got the same issues recurring across quite a few weeks, I think, in terms of what's going on in the news, but I think it's good.
No, I think that's a fair point, actually. I think maybe we spent the last couple of months around similar issues with AI, facial recognition, looking at similar kind of sectors as well, actually. But hopefully the news isn't getting too repetitive. We might have to seek out and find different things, do some journalistic work. But we do still think there's some really interesting conversational pieces that come off the back of the session today. I think it's a great session, so I won't give too much away. I'll let you jump right in. Happy Friday, everybody. Got on the GDPR radio session today after having a session with Benga last week. We spoke about the DPO and the role of the DPO when they're on leave. So back into the news, which is great because I think we've got a couple of exciting bits to sort of pick apart. Amber, is there anything in particular that is screaming out to you?
Yeah, I think I'll start with the top of my list, to be fair, which is I saw an article the other day that Reform had announced that they had plans to scrap the GDPR in favour of a more light touch version. So similar to that in the one in New Zealand. So what are your thoughts on that?
It's interesting. There's been a lot to say about reform in respect to data protection recently.
Yeah.
I know they obviously seemingly have their opinions of data protection law, but it's slightly ironic, isn't it? Because funnily enough, Reform of the political party are in a little bit of bother about some of their data protection activities at the moment. And it, is an interesting turn of events that now they think that there's too much red tape in respect to data protection. And, New Zealand are technically an adequate country in respect to, international transfer sort of frameworks. But I don't know. I've never really liked the argument that the GDPR is like it restricts and gives too much red tape in respect to what businesses can do in respect to sort of like innovation and they're claiming to reduce enforcement. I mean, we don't see much enforcement anyway. If you run the risk of even like lessening individual rights and the enforcement power of something like the ICO, you're just making data protection be something that's not going to be taken seriously at all. And then maybe that's what Reform want. Maybe they just want it to be something that isn't treated very seriously, so they can continue to get away with some of the issues that have been circling around some of their activities at the moment. So I think it's stupid. I think it's just one of those things that's going to be said and nothing's going to be done. I would think so. I really couldn't say anything happening in that regard.
Particularly because it's principle-based, I find it difficult to believe that it's too confined because, whenever you sort of look at anything within the GDPR or data protection related, it's always a matter of risk and what's proportionate to the risk, what's necessary. To me, it seems very fair. And it seems quite flexible as well in the ways that it can be applied to suit different types of businesses depending on their sort of business structure or the risks that are present within the business. And there are some things that are set in stone, like you must do a DPIA if it's a high-risk processing activity, but, that seems entirely fair. I think it just seems to be, like you say, a bit ironic because obviously they're facing scrutiny for not complying with responding to access requests and deletion requests. So now they're asking for a more light touch structure. It's
not only that, but their marketing activities as well that we've seen recently, and some of the collection of special category data that we've seen.
Yeah.
So I think they're just trying to have a moan. I think they're unhappy about the situation they're put in, and it seems that they're in some kind of minefield of data protection. But they're not the only political pie that I'm sure.
No, historically, I think there's a common theme of political parties not being very compliant.
Well, for sure. I mean, when we had James Robson on maybe a couple of months ago, he spoke on that. And if you've not watched that session, if it is still about, then feel free to do so. But we kind of spoke about how a lot of the political parties weren't really in the right position, especially in respect to rights request. We're fighting a bit of an uphill battle there, but it's an interesting piece of news. It's something to talk about, but only really from a position of disdain. I mean, I'm not I'm not really spoken to many practitioners who have stated that they think the rules have to be, kind of loosened a little bit. It's only really the odd person that doesn't really care about data protection who would say that they have to be sort of like eased up a little bit. Unless maybe people do, but it's going to have an impact on adequacy, not only the arrangements we have here, but maybe the arrangements we have with other organisations. I mean, yes, New Zealand does have an adequacy decision, but it doesn't necessarily mean that our model and our adoption would be treated in the same regard necessarily, because I can't imagine it would be a direct sort of compare there. So it's interesting. Again, I don't think it's something that's going to happen, but it is an interesting talking point. There were a few other interesting bits actually. Did see some stuff a little bit further on about the week about two bits of news about airports actually. The first one being about a cyber attack at three main UK airports that exposed around 8.7 million customers' personal data, specifically Manchester, London Stansted, and East Midlands Airport, where allegedly customer email addresses, telephone numbers, vehicle registrations, and postcode, which was collected via Wi-Fi registrations and car park bookings. So if you want to park at the airport, or if you want to sign up free Wi-Fi, has then been exposed in a cyber attack in these three main airports. There's no particularly sensitive details in respect to bank details or anything like that, which is obviously very positive. But there's clearly at the moment a lot of cyber attacks focused on things like airports, and especially in recent months as well. It does. This one seems to potentially maybe have been one where they've got off a little bit lucky, but there is a potential for something like this to be quite catastrophic if they can get their hands on things like bank details, if they are paying for things like their parking. Obviously, it's fortunate that they've treated it with a little bit higher level security, which is obviously the ideal. And I'm glad I'm glad that is the case at the very least. But there's a significant amount of people, isn't it? 8.7 million. That's a lot of people. Yeah,
and particularly because it says it's across three major airports, you kind of wonder about their networks and whether they're actually segmented at all, because I think that's a big thing, isn't it? Like, a cyber attack is one thing, but if all your databases are connected and they can easily access one through another, then inevitably you're going to leak a lot more information than what's just in one database. And it appears here that it's sort of been across multiple.
Well, they probably utilise similar. They probably utilise similar processes, I would imagine.
Yeah.
And that might be where the weaknesses are. I mean, you can see it when you look at sort of organisations that potentially, if you look at things like the NHS that have sort of like broader access systems for NHS suppliers that then roll out to more branches of the NHS. You then run into loads of sort of access issues and loads of complications like that, and naturally you seem to be a little bit more of a target. But you make a very keen point, Vaughan, actually. When you do try to, I think just in general, in trying to sort of join free Wi-Fi now, which I've always been a bit more wary about these days, especially once I began my career in data protection. I didn't used to be bothered. I just felt like I needed the Wi-Fi, but it does feel like, and especially, and again, it's been a while since I probably tried to connect to anything free, but to the information they ask and to the extent, it does feel quite significant. I mean, I don't know if it's potentially intended for analytics and hopefully to get some kind of marketing through the door. I'd probably say it feels like the main thing, doesn't it? I've definitely probably had my fair share of unsolicited marketing in my time through stuff like free Wi-Fi. I'd probably more previously, but when I wouldn't have really noticed as much. But it is a lot of data. I get the car park booking. You need a certain amount of data for that, of course, but for the sake of setting up Wi-Fi, what do you actually feasibly need on someone's device, really?
Particularly when you see some that are just, log in and they don't really ask for anything or connect to the Wi-Fi, and others then are asking you for your name and date of birth and where you're born and your favourite chocolate. You think, oh, well, why do you need all this information? But I agree, it must be tailored towards sort of like analytics and marketing.
Well, because there's no need to collect it, is there? I mean, if we're looking at it from respect to the principles, presumably, I imagine they argue they have a legitimate interest in collecting it. I mean, granted, I've never really seen as much of a privacy statement or notice or anything in respect to what they're actually doing with the data. You just always tend to see it tends to be a little bit of a gimme that tends to be a pre-ticked marketing box that we have to navigate. in order to sign up to this Wi-Fi. And again, if they are operating on that model as well, which is potential, that is almost that, when we're looking at the freely given aspect of consent, it's either we'll give you Wi-Fi or we'll market to you. And that is obviously an issue in respect to what we're looking at with direct marketing in the Pekka. But I'd just like to see how they would justify it. And what they would actually do if someone was to object, to be honest with you. I imagine the answer would be that, you can't have Wi-Fi in these places, but then is that fair? I mean, especially if they potentially rely on something like consent. I don't know if they would have done in this case.
I don't tend to see the tick box, but I don't know if I suppose I never really look because I never tick them.
It's been a while since I think I've tried to connect to any kind of free Wi-Fi. Maybe I'll have to have a test.
Yeah, I doubt most of compliant. It's probably bundled in the terms and conditions.
Yeah, well, there's always the sort of general accepting the terms of signing up to the network, isn't there? And I imagine there's some kind of thinly veiled statement there, but it's probably a piece to look into, to be honest with you, because that's the kind of information that I think people give and then don't realise to what extent maybe that is then used and then shared and then furthered. I think it's instances like that where you start to look at sort of like the loss of control over data. Especially when we're looking at things like, potential data minimization, the accuracy of that data, potentially when we're looking at things like retention as well. We was having interestingly enough, we was in a weird situation. Our conversation with Phil, it was quite a good, interesting conversation. I guess I wonder what your thoughts are with it, Amber. We were talking about retention, actually. We had a conversation about retention. And we were talking about how the advice from the ICO is very asset focused, which we think is quite conflicting to the actuality, where we believe it's more purpose based and more purpose focused, as aligned with the ROPA. But what we think idealistically is retention, if you're looking at it from an asset based perspective, is that even a feasible thing, looking at an asset and giving it a retention period? Because if you have a system, and we say the information on this system has this retention period, presumably there's going to be information within this asset that will need to be held for a shorter period of time. For example, a HR system, a CV, maybe a shorter period of time, as opposed to your actual HR data. I don't know how much sense it makes to give an asset a retention period in terms of it being actionable, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I agree. I think, well, first of all, you'd obviously have to look at the statutory requirements anyway. So arguably, if you're assigning one retention period to one asset, then you may not be meeting all the statutory requirements. But like you say, generally, storage limitation is based on the purpose of processing and how long you require it for that purpose. So to me, it makes a lot more sense to assign the retention periods in correlation with that purpose, rather than trying to sort of overgeneralize or assign them sort of more broadly. I think it's good to be granular with them.
Well, it's weird because the ICO claim that it's the wording kind of implies that it's asset based, and I've always found that quite strange, because I do think that's probably very hard to do. But maybe it's just a lapse in their advice, or maybe that's what they expect. But there's a difference between the requirement to actually register your assets as opposed to the requirement to register your processing. And I imagine there's one they should be focusing more as a regulatory data protection. But it is a weird point.
I think there's a lot of misconceptions, I suppose, or I don't know, misinterpretations throughout their guidance. I've noticed a lot of the times, like if I've generally gone to them to ask them for advice, I might receive something back that's a bit different to the guidance online.
Have you ever been in any positions where, because I've been in a situation before where I'm working with a customer and they are doing something a certain way, and I've opposed it, and I've said maybe this is better, or this might not be quite right, I would do this, and then they would say, well, actually, this is like direct advice that we've received from the ICO. It puts you in a sticky position, doesn't it? Because it then doesn't change my mind, and I then don't believe that they're right, because I probably still stick quite firmly to my guns. But there is that weird risk of, if the ICO is saying it's okay, then should we be just going ahead, considering that they're the regulator, should we be going ahead with what we advise, even though we may not 100% agree? But I think maybe that lies with the level of competence between each answer a sort of a caseworker can give on a case. There's no way to make sure that all the caseworkers are like blanket the well, at least not from what I can see from the ICO, because I can't say I've ever received a consistent sort of approach across the board from them. I think most people will likely have had differing advice from the ICO at some kind of point if they've ever reached out to any kind of caseworker. So I don't know. My approach has always been to probably follow what I'm suggesting. But if you want to take the advice of the caseworker, make sure that you can basically document that your justification is what you're doing based on that caseworker, because then it should be well and good. And then if it comes to another caseworker reviewing it and they think it's a problem, then we can say, well, actually, we did receive this advice from you guys prior.
Yeah.
That will go a certain way, but to what extent? I mean, I've seen they give some pretty poor advice before, to be really honest.
Well, that's it, isn't it? Because ultimately, if you've got the guidance in front of you and in black and white it says one thing, and then you get advice from the ICO and it says, something that's almost conflicting with that, you think, which one is the best one to rely on? Because I've got the evidence here in black and white on the ICO website, but alternatively, I've spoken to someone on the phone who's advised otherwise. Like you say, you kind of need to have it documented that the person on the phone has said this, but they can always then turn around and argue that the guidance says the alternative. So I actually had a case like this really recently, where one of my clients had received advice from the ICO in relation to the ADCOP, so the age appropriate defined code, and the whole sort of issue was whether they were defined or they fell under the definition of an information society service. Or I suppose whether that particular process and activity did. And because it was funded by the local authority, the ICO had advised that actually this doesn't constitute an information society service because you're not receiving any remuneration for it, and the service isn't being sort of requested particularly by that individual, which somewhat made sense. But then when I was reading the guidance, it seemed that it didn't quite align with that. And in some scenarios, it does make sense, but then remuneration can be defined in lots of different ways. It doesn't technically have to be money as such. It's some sort of benefit, I suppose. So, it left me very baffled, and I didn't really know which way to go with it. But
it's interesting. That's an interesting sort of point of view. But gain isn't inherently money, is it? Always necessarily in terms of the benefit. I mean, if we take it back to the example of the free Wi-Fi, it's free, but as Noel very, very rightly puts, it's free. Free. Is it free? Really? You are paying a price in some respects. You're paying a price with your data, which they are going to then use to their own benefit. And I think there's, occasionally, misconceptions with things like this. Free apps, free games, free websites that you can access, and you can only accept the cookies and stuff like that. Especially when we're looking at consent and pay mechanisms with, especially a lot of like newspapers and
I still
stuff
don't
like
get how
that.
that's. I see the arguments on both sides, but I still don't understand how that's.
Oh, I don't see the argument. I don't. I've been very firmly in that camp of I think it's ridiculous, but I just don't understand how it's remotely justifiable. But
No.
I think it's because it might further a better economic agenda for these big organisations. I don't know, but it is. I've always found it to be really silly, but it's hard to conflict with what is exactly there and as said is the case. So
particularly because it's PECA as well, and I feel like when it comes to PECA, it's generally more like stringently enforced. So to think that they're sort of allowing people to charge you to basically decline cookies, where is that freely informed, like freely given decisions?
Well, they think it's a fair trade, don't they? Was the argument. They'd say, "Oh, we believe it as long as the price is fair." That's a fair equivalent to pay, and I just think that's so wrong. I just think that's really wrong.
And I think they argued as well that you don't have to access that information. There's no requirement. It's like if you want to view that information from that source, from the Mirror or whomever, then that's your sort of choice. But you can alternatively go elsewhere to find the same information. But
it's interesting. But there was a period of time where we were getting sort of asked loads of questions like this. Back when a couple of years ago on support, we was getting loads of stuff like this about the model, and about people being like, well, can we adopt something like that as well? We used to before it was like actually kind of approved almost. We were kind of like, well, no, obviously not. But now it's kind of a much harder. But when we spoke about it way back when, it feels like ages ago. This now it might have been when I first this is when I kind of first started on the podcast with Phil and with Joe and stuff, and we're talking about it's just like there's no way that this won't result in it not being allowed, and probably be quite surprised if someone told me back then that would be the case. But it is interesting. It's a good talking point if anything. But
yeah.
couple more bits in the news, of course, because we strayed a little bit. I mentioned airports. I had another similar case related to an airport about a UK resident who was stranded in Spain recently after an e-visa misidentification. Effectively, this lady who was a UK resident for 8 years was stopped at departure gates and blocked from boarding her return flight to the UK. Because the e-visa system, or the digital system that they use for it, incorrectly linked her to her twin sister's records, basically, and kept her in Spain to basically say that she can't travel back home because of basically a case of misidentification. It is very interesting because apparently this has been a known technical flaw of these e-visas, affecting twins in particular, presumably identical twins. I'm not an identical twin, so I don't think it will affect me, but I do have a twin, technically speaking. But identical twins, it doesn't specify that, but I'm going to work on the basis that it does. It has been flagged that it is a known error and a flaw of the system. Why deploy it then? If it's such an obvious flaw,
Yeah.
why would you work on that basis when we're looking at potential accuracy issues? The implications of getting something like that wrong, like in this situation, could be relatively severe.
Why was it not taken into consideration as well? Because like you say, I understand why maybe they deploy it, but inevitably if it's a well-recognised flaw, then there should be systems in place to sort of counteract that and not interfere with people's lives. Because I appreciate maybe the risk wasn't massive here, but I'd be a bit annoyed if I missed my
Well, you'd
flight.
probably be very annoyed, I imagine. But apparently they've been resolving any rarer issues like this within 24 hours, which is something at the very least, and they've not been there for too long. But
yeah.
if we've identified such an obvious flaw and risk, then what are we trying to do to appease for that? If it's the case where we have to keep them, even though we know that it's a flaw, does that mean every time we kind of keep somebody back because we think there's somebody else, we're probably thinking, oh, they might have a twin actually? Is it good to work on that generalization and that basis? But it doesn't seem very reliable to me if that's the case. But are we going to see issues like this with these kind of methods of identification? When we tie it back to all the police stuff that we spoke about recently, the chances of misidentification through similar means is also probably quite likely as well. If you have an identical twin who may be considered to maybe be more violent as well, does that mean you're also at the risk of that misidentification? And the potential risk of that may be more severe.
Exactly, yeah. Especially when they're pushing facial recognition across lots of different sectors now. So obviously the police, and they're even looking at introducing it in Scotland in terms of football to sort of like identify hooligans. But then you sort of, like you say, when we're introducing this on a much broader scale, then there's more inherent risks if this is the case. And, we've already got people clever enough to sort of impose injection attacks and stuff and, carry out these grand sort of schemes online with phishing. So you think if people are clever enough, they could kind of utilise this weakness to their own advantage. I'm not saying, everyone's got an evil twin and they're going to go around and cause
maybe
chaos,
the odds are unlikely.
But I still think it's like, is it that hard to impersonate someone else? If facial recognition is that lagging, maybe, could be a cause for concern, really, if people want to get away with things.
Yeah, possibly.
It's a bit of a stretch, but I think it's interesting to consider.
It's an interesting thought. And I think specifically with the ICO stuff, with facial recognition, obviously, and the police are obviously very, very clear that this is something that they want to do. The ICO have largely said that they're on board with it in principle, but they have found that they went and did some audits of some police forces recently, and found a couple of oversights in respect to their retention, their image sourcing, and their bias testing, among some other things. But those things in particular, probably mainly quite concerning. If we're identifying issues with its potential bias, which we know we've already seen sort of in recent sort of news pieces, that's the thing that you'd want them to feel the most confident about realistically. Why run roll out a device like this if we're aware that there's significant bias issue potentially? And I think it's something that we're going to see every week in the news now until something substantial happens, either which way. But it is nice that the ICO is going out and auditing it at the very least, and that they're keeping an eye on it. I'm quite pleased to see that in the main, I think I'd say.
Yeah, I know Norway as well. I've got a news piece from this week about Norway tightening their rules when it comes to like facial recognition, particularly in the realm of sort of smart glasses and being used in public spaces, and the possibility to covertly record people. I think I also saw another news piece that mentioned that there's sort of people and technologies out there now that are offering their services to dim the flash on these meta glasses, which is the key indicator that someone's obviously recording.
Yeah, I did see something like that. That would like. You think you could probably just like tape over it? Maybe, I don't know.
Well, yeah.
But it's
A bit police hack.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it would record in this. I guess not. No, 'cause I don't need the light to record, does it? No.
I suppose it depends if you're in the dark.
Well, I suppose, yeah. But it is. I don't know. It seems like they're almost like there are a couple of people who are kind of leaning into the covertness of the glasses. I just don't know to what extent, and to what extent do these glasses even need to exist? Like, and that's still what I just don't understand.
Yeah, I don't understand what people are buying these for. I mean, I don't want to know actually, but I don't know if anyone in the comments or in the chat has smart glasses.
Well, I know a lot of the issues surrounding it were around people recording individuals, out in the street and recording interactions with them. A couple like in America, it was a lot of like these like horrible like pickup artists, so to speak. Artist is a very thinly veiled term in this case, but these people who would go with these glasses and basically just be nuisances, to be honest with you.
Yeah. And these things are getting published online. I've seen a lot of things online about people, like having interactions in public, and they've been recording them. It's basically like wearing a body cam, but it's a lot more covert because you obviously see a body cam and it's clear that,
No, I mean that's a fair shout, Noel. To be fair, I mean definitely a use for it. I have seen someone told me when I was delivering some training at some point that they can actually be used for like language interpretation to some degree. So like it could cut out a potential language barrier, which I think is fantastic. Stuff like that sounds absolutely great. Is to what degree do we need to do things like facial recognition? Like, what is that for? What is Meta making that for? Then maybe the issue is they don't. It's hard to not make it covert because they want to retain the style of the glasses looking nice, I guess. You can't walk around with big text that says I'm recording kind of thing.
No, but when you have like a GoPro, that's the alternative, isn't it? Most people use GoPros for things like mountain biking, but I suppose the glasses are probably a bit cooler, or you've not got something attached to your head. But
a bit easier, yeah. I could see the need for stuff like that. I don't know what I would use it for in my life, but I'm sure there are people that would use them. And as I say, they were speaking about we got into the conversation with these glasses in the workplace, which I know has been a conversation in the chat sort of recently, past couple of weeks, and talking about people using it for, as I say, to like cut out a potential language barrier. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, something you don't even consider, to be fair. But then I suppose you argue where's the necessity to record things? Because can it still use these functions without recording? And
I mean, potentially. I don't. Yeah, as I say, I don't know. I'm almost keen to buy a pair just to see. But I thought like, what a waste of money, because like I'd only be doing it just to see what it does. But
you'll see us next week with our meta glasses on.
I'll be recording back at you. Be double recording. But I mean, I don't know if anybody is actual user of meta glasses here today. Maybe what you use it for, I don't know. It's interesting. I could see like maybe at like concerts and stuff like that. It could be useful. I know there are sometimes concerns over recording at concerts as well. We had that quite famous piece, maybe it might have been last year now, about that Coldplay concert, about cameras there, which is always an interesting case. But I think I see a place for technology like it. If it can genuinely do things like this. I know it's been an aid for people with disabilities, for people who may have some kind of accessibility issues in some cases. if that's the case, great. But you always find that there's always a weird undertone to these kind of things.
Yeah, I think it's just about balancing it and managing it, isn't it? Because ultimately, like if it can, like I say, if it can do these things without requiring recording, then that would be great. But ultimately, there also might be things where it's worth, it's helpful to record and it might assist people, which I'm not considering. So it's, yeah, it is quite interesting, but
Unfortunately, it seems like sometimes, most of the time, the problem is people. More than the laws and more than what they're trying to set up. It tends to be the people using them that tend to create issues for things like this. So maybe it's always going to be an issue, and maybe there's nothing that can be done. But
yeah, I think so. I imagine it's the same with GoPros, but I suppose I've never really touched on that side of things or thought about it. But I suppose because they're more obvious.
we see a lot of
then
body
they're-
worn cameras in certain
Of
sectors that
course,
we work
yeah.
with, but they are, like as you say, they are more obvious. And they're typically, especially with like the police and stuff, they'll tell you if they're going to turn it on. They'll tell you that you are turning it on, that you're being recorded.
And they're being used in a professional capacity, whereas I suppose
Yeah,
if it's being used for private use, it's like it can't really be under the scope of GDPR, can it? Because it's just personal use. So that's always interesting.
Yeah, it's an hard balance. It's an hard balance. But it's an interesting thing. I would be intrigued if we ever see any workplaces that do roll them out. And I know, as I say, we've had discussions about it. So if it ever happens, give us a shout. It'd be an interesting discussion point. Couple more light touch bits again with the police. Bit of a focus on the police at the moment. The Met Police had recently exposed around 140 email addresses of people who had been receiving updates about the Mohammed Al Fayed investigation. Although it's kind of like the classic sort of CC instead of BCC kind of situation. And again, with these breaches, whilst that looks fine at face value, when you look a little bit deeper into it and you think about potentially the nature of people who may sign up, these may be very vulnerable individuals. Could reveal links to potential witnesses, or if they're part of any kind of groups, potentially even in some victims or people related to victims in some cases. Likely those are the people who are going to want to be interested. Granted, that might not be all the people who are interested, but that is a real potential risk. And I think the reason I wanted to touch on it is I think it's always to say that, it can be a little bit of a dangerous game to look at breaches at such face value sometimes. And I think that's why proper reporting and having good, strong forms and registers is really important. Because it might be easy to take someone's word for it potentially, or just wrong this person, wrong number kind of thing. The situation, the context, the same with anything in data protection, actually. The context is ultimately so important with everything. And it's a big decider on risk all the time. I won't even review a personal data breach form if I don't think I have enough understanding of the context. I'll get, because you want to act quickly on these things. I'll read the form as quickly as I can. I'll be getting in touch with people immediately if I don't understand literally everything. I feel like I've got to be so in the know with everything to even give a decent assessment of the potential risks. So I've just think it's an important thing to stress, really.
Yeah, absolutely. The context makes a massive difference in relation to like the probability of the harm that might be caused from a data breach. But I think it touches on a theme that we've sort of mentioned across quite a few weeks, particularly when we did our session on training, in that it seems to be that a lot of the most damaging data breaches tend to be a result of such a sort of minor mistake that should be something that's ideally covered quite early on in your training. Just as a professional.
Human error is a big part of personal data breaches. Emails is like the largest causes for personal data breaches. And there were some stats. I need to find those stats at some point. Shared them during a training session, because the training session we had a bit of a focus on kind of do's and don'ts of email handling, good practice and stuff like that. And we came to the conclusion that, like, for a lot of organizations, this is the reality of 99% of the personal data breaches, really. But it's how do you re-change that line of thinking? Again, human error is not something you can necessarily just prevent.
No. But it tends to be a lack of awareness. Obviously, people make mistakes. We're all human. And that's totally like, you can't help that. I think in a lot of cases, though, it tends to be just like people are unaware. And I suppose if you don't know something, how do you know it's wrong? Or, people don't tend to know the difference between CC and BCC. But it's such an important distinction because it can make a massive difference when it comes to something like this.
Yeah, because you get, I've spoken to people about this before, and then you'll go, why? It's just an email address. What are they going to do with an email address?
Yeah, but then the context.
Yeah, it's not always about that. And that's exactly why context matters so much, and why, you've got to be such an advocate of, trying to make people care about data protection. And it can be hard. And I have it with friends, I have it with family who are confused about the importance of it and why it matters. And, sometimes you can't force these people to care personally, but professionally, they've got to understand that there is why it is so paramount, and what the potential implications are, not just on the business and on them, but to these people who are involved in personal data breaches. Most people would look at most significant data breaches that have been in the news and feel very sorry for some of the individuals involved from a human perspective and from a moral perspective.
Yeah.
It's about trying to bring that to life to them without worrying them too much. You don't want to put the fear in them of a personal data breach too much, where they're terrified that everything they do is going to be a breach, and that their kind of effectiveness is struggling as a result of it. It's very plausible that is a thing that I've seen some e-learning and stuff that really heavily focuses on you can go to prison, you can be fined.
Yeah, you can be sacked.
Yeah.
It tends to be that it's almost made like a data breach is a massive sort of negligence, whereas sometimes it is just an accident. And I think when you incite that fear in people, it puts a lot of pressure on people to act perfectly, which can then go the opposite way. I think a lot of people cope well under pressure. I mean, obviously some people do, but I think almost adding that unnecessary pressure to people that it doesn't feel like they can even come to a manager if they have a concern that there might have been a breach, or if they have a question. It kind of tends to act the opposite way. Oh,
definitely. You can't create an air of wariness around personal data breaches and like an over wariness about data in general. If you go down that line of thinking, you sometimes run the risk of people being like, well, the GDPR says we can't get that, and we can't collect this, and we can't use that. We can't collect anything because of the GDPR. And it's like, no, that's not.
No, GDPR doesn't say you can't.
No, exactly.
Anything.
But sometimes with the wrong kind of communication and the wrong perception of data protection law, you can find individuals in a position, and I don't really blame them, where they're thinking, well, I can't do that because of data protection law.
No, you can. There's loads of ifs and buts, but that's
You've just got to be a little bit more careful. But at the end of the day, if you need something, I think I was in a situation where, off the back of an audit, a customer who engaged with us had kind of gone through and said, I think we need to get rid of this, we need to get rid of that, and this, and this, and this, and this. We can't hold any of this anymore. And it's like, no, that's not really that's not what the point they were trying to bring across. Is that and they really had their backs up, and they were worried. It's like, we've been doing this wrong for ages. It's not. We're just going to make slight tweaks, and we got to adapt things. And sometimes it's just about understanding the landscape of it a little bit more. But it's not the easiest thing in the world, and we talk about training so much here on the podcast, because obviously the podcast is an awareness thing. Really, is not really training in of itself, but training is awareness in that respect, and that the podcast is awareness. And very occasionally I do actually have people who say that they know members of staff who maybe aren't involved in data protection, but will still join the podcast because they're intrigued and because they care about that from respect to their role. And that's fantastic. I mean, that's exactly what we set this up for. For DPOs predominantly, but if it can be used as a tool like that as well, then I think it's absolutely great. I mean, I appreciate not many on the ground staff would want to listen to us talk about data protection in the news for 45 minutes. They might find that a little tedious, but I think sometimes it's about going enough to make it more personable. The news is a really good tool for that, I think, for training case law in the news, because people are inherently interested. I imagine if you went to your teams today, on Monday, maybe there's some awareness, and you spoke to them about, what do we think about meta glasses from the perspective of people's privacy, I imagine that would generate quite an interesting conversation. And I guess these are the things we've got to think about from the perspective of awareness, isn't it? Is what will generate that conversation.
Yeah, definitely. And the fact we have sort of like an open channel for communication as well, if anyone has any questions, I think that's really good, because it's like you're in an environment where hopefully everyone feels like they can ask a question and it's never a silly question, because ultimately data protection is so complex. And if it wasn't complex, then you wouldn't need people like us sort of, teaching people and helping
Suppose so.
people that.
As with anything, right? And you're right. It's why we're here. We're here to try and make data protection easy. If it was really easy, then there would be
have this.
well, yeah, not this big blue thing behind us, and we won't be talking to you every week. But we're kind of glad there's a nuance with it. To be honest with you, it does make things more interesting, and I do think ultimately it does give businesses a lot of good wiggle room to work with as well. I think it's pretty fair in the main.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think that those are the main bits I wanted to talk about anyway. Was there anything specifically on your end that we not spoke about? Because I know there was a fair few pieces of news that we had.
I think I just have a couple in relation to children's data and the Online Safety Act, which I know is Kate's cup of tea, so I feel bad stealing it. But basically, I know there's been some stuff obviously recently with the age verification measures and age assurances, obviously the bans for under 16s. And I know Pornhub, or the owner of Pornhub, has basically challenged this approach in that, I know I wrote a blog about this as well, that age verification is essentially pushing users away from the more compliant sites towards sites that don't check age properly, which, is something that I spoke about in a blog a little while ago when I think it first sort of dropped. But I think that's really interesting because that was one of the arguments that I made, and that I completely understand why we have these age assurance measures in place and what they're there for, and the ban and so on. But inevitably, children are going to find another way to access the sites they want to access, whether it be this or, other sites.
It's hard to stop someone that dead set on their goals, unfortunately. You see it with everything. I mean, like as a child, the chances are if you really want to do something, you're probably going to find a way. I think it's a very clear point. If we're putting obligations on, especially organisations like Pornhub, we have to be able to make sure we can put similar obligations on similar, maybe less known, maybe more risky sites. And if we can't, then are we creating more of an issue by the changes that we're proposing potentially?
Yeah.
It is real interesting, and I think a lot of the Online Safety Act stuff is really interesting. But they do raise a fair point, but that doesn't necessarily mean that just because other people aren't doing what they should, that then you should also adopt that approach. Do you know what I mean? It's not like they're doing it kind of thing.
Yeah, it's more a reflection of the sort of legislation in general, or the act in general. And I think it's the same sort of approach you need to take with AI, in that you don't want to be a blocker, because inevitably a blocker just causes more problems because people just go around the issue. I think it's trying to allow children to access social media and sites, but having sufficient controls in place to limit the risks. Oh, excuse me.
Excuse me. But yeah, I mean, on that note, I suppose I don't know if that cough was signaling the end of the podcast, but we're just about at that time. So thank you all very much for joining for another radio session. We will be back next week. I do not remember what the topic is, but I will not be here actually. But you'll be joined by two people. Maybe Amber, maybe not. But it won't be me. But we'll see you all next week for another topical session. We hope you have a lovely weekend and a nice little bank holiday Monday as well. And we'll catch you all next week. Take care.
Bye.